We are what we eat, and the food we eat has an enormous impact on the lives of animals, the environment, and human health.
The food we eat is incorporated into the cells of our bodies. And today we're eating food that is raised with petrochemical fertilizers, with biocides. We're eating toxic food, and it has an impact on us. And animals are also eating these toxic grains.
Our food providers tell us that what we eat is safe and nutritious. They use marketing to convince us that the animals we eat don't suffer and are leading good lives. They don't tell us the impacts that our food choices are having on our health or the environment.
I mean, the reality is that, most of us are eating over-packaged, over-travelled, anonymous food. We haven't got a clue who produced it, where it came from. I think it's an intrinsic part of culture to have the knowledge where your food comes from, and I think it's hugely to our detriment that we have, to a large extent, lost that.
We've been bombarded by advertising messages saying that meat is healthy or you need to drink cow's milk to get calcium. So these are myths, but they're beliefs that many people have.
And it's not just the food industry who are misleading us. Advice on what we should and shouldn't eat seems to change every day, with meat and dairy interest groups lobbying hard to influence government policies for their benefit.
We have an industry that is one of the biggest industries in the entire world behind this. They want us to consume animals. That is how they make their money. And then you've got the government backing that up as well.
Animals have been used as disposable commodities, industrialised under the ruse of factory farms. They are slaughtered in horrific numbers.
I think you have to first educate people about who these animals are. There's someone on your plate when you go to a restaurant and order meat.
The planet has now reached tipping point. Poisoned rivers, exhausted soils, and climate change have reached dangerous levels.
We know more about the outer rings of Saturn than we do a teacup full of soil. And yet, soil is one of the fundamental things which we need.
Scientists believe that our food system is no longer sustainable if we continue producing and consuming the kind of food at the rate that we do.
As a consumer, it's very difficult to know how much of a dose of pesticide you are being delivered in every mouthful you take. There has not been enough testing, certainly on chemicals that can impact neurological development in utero and of young children.
If we want to move to a sustainable food system, we need to look at what we're producing and how we're producing it. But the biggest thing we have to do is look at consumption, and the biggest part of the impacts from consumption are from meat and dairy.
Our current system of farming and food production is broken. Humans cannot continue to eat as if there is no future and no responsibility anymore. The industrialisation of our food system has led to a public health crisis. In February 2018, doctors, food producers and vets held a conference at the Royal Society of Medicine in London. They came together to discuss antimicrobial resistance and the impact of modern farming on human health.
For the first time for more than a century, the improvement in life expectancy in this country has halted. It was not that many years ago that doctors and epidemiologists started talking about the potential for this generation of children living shorter lives than their parents. So I think the UK faces a public health emergency, and one of the issues that is at the heart of that is undoubtedly our food system.
Recent NHS statistics are disturbing. 67% of men and 57% of women in the UK are overweight or obese. It is estimated by 2030, almost 1 in 10 people will have diabetes. Diet is the main cause.
We have a problem in England with childhood obesity. We have 1 in 5 children coming into school at reception age overweight or obese, and we have 1 in 3 leaving primary school overweight and obese. So we're making it worse. A couple of years ago, there were over 500 children under the age of 16 that acquired type 2 diabetes. That is not an illness that you catch, okay? It's through lifestyle choices, and it's through diet. You can't outrun a bad diet. Children need to know what they're eating that will extend their lifespan. Researchers think that this generation of children will not live as long as their parents. We've never had that before, and this is because of the food that they're eating.
We all like to say, oh, I'm in control of the food system. You're not. This is a fantasy. All the time. By the time a child is 5, they've seen 10,000 advertisements. They're got young, very young indeed. We live in an obesogenic environment. Everything is encouraging us to get fat. The astonishing thing is that some people aren't. Okay? Why is it? How is it? And that tends to be about income. The richer you are, the thinner you are. The poorer you are, the fatter you are. In poor countries, it's reverse.
One of the most comprehensive studies of the effects of nutrition was published in 2005. The China study was a China, Cornell, Oxford University project led by biochemist T. Colin Campbell and Thomas M. Campbell II. The 20-year research programme directly linked countries with a high consumption of animal-based foods to death rates from Western diseases.
And they found that, broadly speaking, there are diseases of affluence and there are diseases of poverty. Affluence promotes certain diseases, and it's very much certain types of cancers. It's breast cancer, prostate cancer, it's heart disease, it's strokes. And so they're like, okay, well, if relatively wealthy, well-fed people are getting so much disease, what is it that's doing it? And basically stripping it down to the bare facts, meat and dairy, over and over and over are linked to chronic disease.
I had type 2 diabetes and I lost control of my blood, so I decided to read up on what was happening to me and what I should and couldn't eat. And I lost something like 2.5 stone in 6 weeks, and I changed the way I was, and it changed my blood, everything, and now I'm not a type 2 diabetic. I went onto a purely vegetarian diet.
Links have also been made between heart disease and arthritis.
I happened to notice that people who had coronary artery disease had arthritis that I could see in the spine. And I went, you know, isn't that interesting? The simple assumption was, well, these are older individuals and of course they're going to get arthritis. But that actually prompts the question, why getting old would give you arthritis? And the answer is, there's nothing about getting old that should give you arthritis, because there are cultures in the world that are old and don't have arthritis.
It is true that you are what you eat, but most importantly, you are what the thing you're eating ate.
There's no doubt that higher up the food chain, there is a bioaccumulation of nasty chemicals. So the cow feeding on just grass in the field will be ingesting the chemicals that are put on that grass and that are inherently in the soil growing up through the grass from old nasty chemicals that were put on maybe decades ago that are persistent and very toxic. But then those more intensely fed animals that are fed in barns where they are fed from a sack of food, that is more likely to have a higher incidence of production and refinement, and therefore every step of refinement that one goes through tends to have a higher level of toxicity in it.
Food is causing massive health problems. Food-related diseases from chronic heart disease, cancers, etc., type 2 diabetes are costing the UK government more than smoking and alcohol combined. So as a taxpayer, I'm paying for the results of a food system that's hurting people and killing people. We've got a food system that works for very few people, and it's all because we've got a food system which is damaging the environment and damaging our health. It's also causing huge amounts of distress for animals. We've got animals in cages.
We've got to the situation now where we know meat causes cancer. It's just that we're not telling people as loudly as we should be doing in the way that we are, for example, with cigarettes. On a packet of cigarettes, it says pretty clearly now that you're going to potentially suffer or die. And that's, of course, what we should be putting on meat packets now. It should just say, on every processed meat, that's bacon, ham, hot dogs, sausages, it should just say, this product causes cancer.
If you or somebody in your family is diagnosed with heart disease or you're severely obese or overweight, whatever the issue is, most doctors say reduce your meat intake, cut it out, and eat more vegetables. Like, that's the one, even growing up, my mom, every time we sat at dinner, eat your vegetables. Why? Because they're the healthiest thing on your plate. We all know that. Why did that get lost somewhere?
The modern Western diet, heavy on meat and dairy products, has been driven by food producers and retailers to fulfill consumer habits. We now live in an environment where food is abundant. We can eat anything we want, whenever we want.
We eat endlessly, we eat all the time, we don't eat set meals, we eat meals and we eat in between them all the time. So I go into my local big railway station. To get to it, I go past 34 eating opportunities. And you see people coming in and off trains and they're eating all the time. And they're doing it out of stress, and they're doing it because it tastes nice and smells nice and it's fatty and sugary, and the whole diet in that sense has totally changed.
If you walk around a supermarket, you can have ready meals. You just put in the microwave for 2 or 3 minutes. People aren't getting those experiences of handling food, of chopping food, of cooking, that patience really, of enjoying that creativity with it.
And I think most people who just eat meat out of habit, you know, get up, we'll have some bacon, maybe have a ham sandwich at lunchtime and some meat for dinner. 3 lots of meat, you'd have had to be the world's most successful hunter ever to have 3 lots of meat a day. We've gone way off nature, haven't we? In fact, we've denatured ourselves.
The creation of food processing has turned eating from a chore to a convenience, from a need to a habit. We now ingest foods that our bodies struggle to deal with: fats and sugars, preservatives and additives, insecticides and pesticides. Food may have become cheap and plentiful, but at what cost?
The rise in certain cancers and in birth defects and in endocrine disruption, autism and so on. Quite likely that they're caused by something that we're putting in our mouths. If it is something that's put in your mouth, then it's something that's changed. And that could quite likely be to do with agricultural practice.
At the root to our public health crisis lies an agricultural and food system that is killing its people. Decades of profit-driven decisions have created a culture in which animals have been abused and exploited, the land has been poisoned, and food producers have become more and more powerful. The population has now become more detached from the origin of the food it eats than at any time in the history of mankind.
We've all been guilty of just not really thinking about where our food came from, not really getting involved in the discussion. We could have learnt more, but we decided that we wouldn't.
Well, I think probably we've been getting increasingly detached from our food ever since the Enclosures Act and the agricultural and the industrial revolution and the urbanisation of our populations, to the extent where it's a sort of romantic idyll to a lot of people of the countryside now, which their image of it bears very little relationship to the reality of it.
To understand how we reached this point in our relationship with food, we need to travel back to where it all started. The Second World War brought Britain to its knees. Food became scarce. Starvation was a real threat. Food security and the need to make sure the country had enough food to feed its people became a central focus for the British government. The people of Britain were encouraged to dig up every spare inch of land to grow food. Farmers were encouraged to produce as much as the land could give.
In the Second World War, Britain was really nearly on its knees, and the Minister of Agriculture in 1939 bought illegally the whole of the Canadian wheat crop secretly with no parliamentary review, because that Britain would have starved had he not done so. And in a sense that was an astonishing wake-up call to the British rulers, because populations become very restive, and indeed you lose wars if you can't feed your armies or your people. And after the Second World War there was an enormous rethink about policy. Whichever party had got in would have done the same.
The Second World War left a bad taste in the mouth. Rationing had been imposed in 1940 and remained in place to help feed the troops and the people at home until 1954, 9 years after Germany surrendered. Governments now needed to feed the starving populations. Farming needed to reinvent itself.
Animal agriculture grew significantly after World War II, when you had these chemical giants and these industrial machinery giants that moved a lot of their production towards agriculture.
Turning the war machine around to focus on intensive food production became essential for everyone. The government was advised to focus primarily on animal protein as a source of nutrition to feed the people. From the 1960s onwards, there was a change in the way our food was produced. Animals that naturally grazed in fields were forced inside large sheds and cages and fed manufactured maize and soybean feeds. The intensive factory farm was born.
Every year in the United States, over 9 billion farm animals are raised and slaughtered, and that doesn't even include fish. They put them in cages and crates where they're packed so tightly they can't even turn around or stretch their limbs. The animals live short, miserable lives, and then they're slaughtered and eaten.
Living beings have become objects, and we want those objects to be as profitable as possible. Chickens, cows, ducks, pigs. And so they are reared in a way that makes it the most efficient to get a profit from them. So how can you make a chicken go from being in the egg to being on your dish as fast as possible?
To encourage farmers to produce more food, the government created a system of financial subsidies to promote the growth of the agricultural sector.
The government gives away about $100 billion a year in subsidies for our food system. Most of that goes to animal agriculture. For decades, factory farming has been subsidized and is very entrenched, and it also has a tendency to want to support big farms, which tend to be these massive factory farms. They've been supported for many years, and so they get the majority of the dollars.
The subsidies in the farming in America are such that the cost of meat is probably half what it actually should be. But also there's a sort of a tax system whereby basically the meat industry can then also say, oh, we're entitled to this amount of money off the government to promote meat consumption. So there's almost, so it's a sort of becomes a vicious circle.
Cattle raised for beef in the US usually start their lives actually on the range on a cow-calf operation, and then they're moved to a feedlot where they're confined by the hundreds or thousands in these barren pens. They're usually implanted with hormones so that they put on weight faster. They're fed a very high grain diet, which is not good for them metabolically, so they suffer from metabolic problems, and then they're killed.
Subsidised intensive agriculture was not just a US incentive. A growing number of UK operators replicated this style of industrialised animal production. In 2016 and 17, the UK government gave away almost £70 million in subsidies to US feedlot-style units, rearing thousands of cattle indoors. Others who received payouts included mega dairies with herds of 1,800 cows, and intensive egg producers using cage housing systems. Poultry and pig mega units, which keep thousands of animals indoors, also benefit. However, fruit and vegetable growers receive just a tiny fraction.
We have to compete for land with arable farmers and dairy farmers, who receive, regular subsidies which amount to 50% of their income. It might be 80% for a hill farmer. For vegetable producers, it would be, less than 5%.
Something extraordinary has happened in the last 70 years. A huge outgrowth of production has worked. Huge effort went from the 1940s, 50s, 60s to increase output. It worked. But now, at the beginning of the 21st century, we see that it damaged the environment, led to obesity, created more problems of over and malconsumption than there are underconsumption. So you've got a more complex set of problems emerging from what appeared to be a success story.
Chicken farming was the first to become industrialised. Some factories contain 30,000 birds. To combat disease, the animals were fed antibiotics. One of the side effects was massive weight gain. Farmers realised this was to their benefit. They made more profit over a much shorter time. Since 1925, the average days to market for a US chicken has been reduced from 112 to just 48 days, while its weight has nearly trebled in size.
They get these huge breasts, and in fact they develop so quickly, so fast, and so much that many of them become crippled. They can't even hold up their own bodies under their own weight.
It doesn't matter where you buy the chicken from, almost all chicken is factory farmed, whether you buy it from Sainsbury's or Waitrose, or whether you buy it from McDonald's or KFC. And almost every single one of those animals is factory farmed. It's 98%.
Growing animals in intensive units became hugely profitable. Industrialised chicken farming paved the way for other types of animal agriculture to follow. Today, over 95% of the pigs we eat are reared in intensive operations. Nursing pigs are confined to farrowing crates. Tails are removed. They have very little chance to exhibit natural behaviours and completely contradict the terms of the UK Animal Welfare Act.
The tail docking, for instance, is because they're so stressed that they self-harm and that they harm other pigs, and they may chew on the tail of the pig next to them. These are behaviors that tell us that these animals in these farrow crates, they are mentally disturbed. And any kind of self-harming behavior in humans or non-humans is a sign that they're emotionally disturbed.
Laurie Marino is a leading expert in studying the brain in animals and how it affects their behaviour. Together with Farm Sanctuary, she developed the Someone Project to create peer-reviewed scientific evidence for intelligence and personality and social complexity in animals.
Having studied dolphins and whales and the effects of captivity on them, and then studying farmed animals, pigs, chickens, cows, goats, etc., the parallels are absolutely clear. These are both groups of animals who are forced into conditions that they cannot live in, let alone thrive in. When I did research on pigs, I was just astonished. And I have studied animal intelligence for a long time. When you really look at who pigs are, you realize they're brilliant animals. They do a lot of things that when you see chimpanzees doing them, you say, wow, they're smart. What we found are that pigs are socially incredibly complex. We actually found that they engage in something called deception. If you have pigs in a situation where they're competing for food and you give them a field, you should see the kinds of ways that they try to outwit each other to try to get the food. I mean, these kinds of things called Machiavellian intelligence were first found in chimpanzees and other primates. We see them in pigs.
In the USA, there are now 450,000 factory farms and 19,961 confined animal feeding operations, known as CAFOs. In recent figures released by the American Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals, they state that 95% of all farmed animals in the US are now intensively farmed. And why is this important? Because the US currently exports over 105,000 metric tons of chicken, beef and pork around the world. They are keen to increase this capacity and have expressed an interest to establish meat trade deals with Britain on leaving the European Union.
You know, I think when the issue of factory farming and slaughter comes up, a lot of times people try to look away. They try not to think about it. And I think that's a big part of the problem with the whole food system, is that people just say, I don't want to think about it. But people are participating, and I think people need to take more responsibility for their actions. You know, slaughter is brutal, it is violent, it is horrendous. And you know, at factory farm slaughterhouses that are trying to kill animals as fast as possible because it's more profitable, you have a greater likelihood of mistakes. In the case of chickens, for example, who are killed by the billions in the United States, you know, thousands per hour, you have live chickens who sometimes are dropped alive into the scalding tank and they're boiled alive.
If we all realised how our food was produced, we wouldn't want it produced that way. I mean, for heaven's sake, I don't know whether you've ever been inside a battery farm for chickens. They're dispiriting, horrible places.
The UK has also followed the US model of mega-style factory farms. In the UK, there are now nearly 1,674 intensive farms with an environmental agency permit to practice, an increase of 26% in the last 6 years alone. These CAFOs and factory farms supply beef, pork, poultry and eggs to Tesco, Sainsbury's, Co-op, M&S, Morrison's, Asda, McDonald's and Nando's. Their labelling displays terms like "from trusted farms" or M&S assured. However, when we contacted some of these leading supermarkets, they were unwilling to tell us which farms supplied their meat. A spokesperson from Waitrose said, "Unfortunately, I cannot divulge any supplier information in regarding to our meat supply, as this is commercially sensitive information." For most of us, our food is out of sight, out of mind. We have little understanding of where the produce is grown or how it is brought to our tables, and our suppliers are reluctant to share this information with the public.
The industry itself wants to make it as easy as possible for people to eat these animals and therefore buy these animals. And so they separate who these animals are from what people see when they go to a restaurant and order a steak, or go into a supermarket and get fryers or ribs or something like that. They are invested in making sure that when people go into that meat department in the supermarket, that they're thinking as little as possible about animals. And they've succeeded.
In 2006, the Animal Welfare Act was passed into UK law, followed in 2007 by the Welfare for Farmed Animals regulation. It recommended 5 basic rights to be upheld: its need for a suitable environment, its need for a suitable diet, its need to be able to exhibit normal behaviour patterns, its need for suitable housing, its need to be protected from pain, suffering, injury and disease. Upholding these basic rights is the least a civil society should do towards its fellow beings, but some farms fall well short, whilst factory farms and slaughter completely contradict the terms of the Animal Welfare Act. Enforcement of these laws has been poor, and cases brought before courts have not been taken seriously. We contacted DEFRA for comment, but are yet to receive a reply.
People should be ashamed of the fact that in the last 50, 60 years it's become acceptable to put animals in cages, whether it's pigs, cows in feedlots, chickens, even some fish are farmed in intensive conditions. Then the animals are being treated appallingly and they're suffering for it. And I just think we have to question why we've done that, because it just seems wrong.
I've been at factory farms and I've seen people gratuitously shock animals, and it's almost as if they're saying that this animal is worth nothing, and that by shocking them and mistreating them this way, I'm demonstrating how little they're worth. It's been said that power corrupts, and I think that's very true, and there's actually science that shows that when somebody has power, that they lose part of their empathy. And when it comes to how we treat farm animals, I think that that's very, very on point. And I've seen people become almost like monsters when it comes to how they treat other animals.
The meat industry has now become a global enterprise. Through takeovers and consolidation, smaller companies have merged into larger ones. JBS, Tyson Foods, Cargill, BRF, Vion, Nippon, Smithfield Foods, Marfrig, Danish Crown and Hormel Foods. These top 10 leading meat companies may not be household names, but they dominate and control the meat market today and generate billions of dollars in revenue. Of those 10, JBS has the capacity to slaughter 80,000 cattle, 115,000 pigs, and 14 million birds every day, with an annual turnover of $49.3 billion. This concentration has led to the control of the entire agricultural economy, offering greater profits, but also leading to higher risk to human health, food safety, and animal welfare.
The livestock sector is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger based on business as usual. And the poultry sector in the US, I spoke at a conference of theirs, and they said, we want to build our sector, we want to get bigger and bigger and bigger. They see other sectors in the livestock sector, say beef, as being the problem, so they want to step in. So they want everyone to eat as much chicken as an American all over the world. The average American eats 48 kilograms of chicken a year, almost a kilogram a week. And we can't all eat that much. There wouldn't be any trees left. We'd have to chop them all down to grow soy. It's purely for their shareholders.
Wherever we look in the food economy, there is concentration. That means bigger companies get bigger and have bigger share of the market. Whether we look at farming, the size has got bigger. There may be lots of small farmers, but the big ones dominate. The same applies in retailing, the same applies in food manufacturing. These are enormously powerful companies. Nestle, the world's biggest food company, sells about 2% of all the food on the planet. You might say, well, that's not much. Wow, it's enormous. And it intends to double it in 10 years. We don't live in a market economy, we live in a hypermarket economy. One company, Tesco in Britain, sells 1/3 of all the food. Asda and Sainsbury's, the second and third, are in the process of merging. So there'll be two companies selling about 50–60% of the food in Britain. This is astonishing. The companies are so big, the government won't do anything about it, but yet says that we live in a market economy. And why does this matter? Because it's a battle about price. It's a battle of control over markets and price.
The dairy sector in the UK has been at the forefront of this market-driven economy. In November 1994, Mrs Thatcher's Conservative government disbanded the Milk Marketing Board, a government-run milk collection and distribution service which controlled and monitored all of the milk from British dairy farms. The primary role of the Milk Marketing Board was to guarantee price to the farmer and ensure supply to consumers through its brand Dairy Crest. Upon the closure of the Milk Marketing Board, Dairy Crest was made public and the UK dairy market was opened up to market forces.
I mean, it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that in the name of free competition, the Milk Marketing Board was dissipated, all the marketing boards have been dissipated, in order to, I would say, to give the food processors a free run at persuading us to eat something else. That's what seems to have happened. I mean, if that's, I suppose that's the free market.
The closure of the Milk Marketing Board had devastating effects on British farming, as the supermarkets moved into the marketplace and began to dictate price. Unit prices for milk dropped by nearly 40% in 18 months, putting farmers under increasing pressure to compete. They responded by trying to increase the volume supplied by their cows. Some farmers struggled to stay in business, but the main impact of the changes were felt by the cows themselves.
You might have a cow that instead of living for 10 years will live for 2 lactations, 2–3 years. And the reason for that is so that we can have cheap milk. I think that says a lot of things about us for not questioning it, for accepting it. A lot of things about the farming system that's gone along with that and then says it's okay, because it's not okay, however you look at it.
Most dairy farms in the UK have adopted intensive systems of animal agriculture to maximise production. The dairy cows are under intense stress as they are kept constantly pregnant in order to make them produce milk every day.
That milk is loaded with hormones, 35 hormones, estrogens, progesterones, adrenal hormones, pituitary hormones, the whole lot, and 11 growth factors including IGF-1. The problem with that as adults is that, say for example, you have got mutated cells and you are at risk of cancer, what IGF-1 does is tell cells to grow, grow, grow. It's linked to breast cancer, it's linked to prostate cancer, it's linked to lung cancer. How come our government and industry isn't behind a drive to say, okay, enough is enough. The National Health Service is on its knees. Diabetes type 2 is out of control. 1 in 2 of us are now getting cancer in the UK. Surely we owe it to the population, even if we don't care about money in the NHS, just out of common decency to at least give people the truth.
The public are largely unaware of how their milk is being produced today. Sophisticated marketing campaigns developed by supermarkets have been designed to reassure consumers that their milk is the best quality and that the animals that produce the milk are having a great life. But this is largely untrue.
If you go to one of these factory farms, you will see cows hooked up to milking machines for most of the day. They have no capacity to move, let alone romp in a meadow.
Jay Wild is the third generation of farmers in his family. He now manages 173 acres of arable pasture in Derbyshire.
We supplied the local Nestlé plant in Ashbourne. Being a grassland area, milk manufacturers set up central depots and everybody tends to take the milk there. 1997 I think we sold the milking herd and changed to organic beef. When you're raising them for beef, although you get attached to them, you have to you do have to keep a sort of some kind of barrier between you and them.
Hello, Tiger Tim. Hello, Tiger Tim.
Then you take them to the abattoir, and with being only a small producer, we usually took them ourselves, which made it seem more real. You couldn't sort of wave them off on the truck. You sort of got to actually take them to the place where they were slaughtered, and I'm sure they could sense
I think that people have this notion that other animals don't have as deep emotions as we do. People don't understand that that's just not the case. Cows and their children have some of the closest bonds in the animal kingdom. People don't realize that, you know, in the dairy industry, you take babies away from their mothers, and a lot of people think, oh, she'll have another, she forgets. But in fact, that's not the case at all. When you take a calf away from her mother, the mother shows signs of incredible emotional distress. She calls out for her child, and that may last a long time.
You don't know what's going through their mind, but it must have been terrifying and nightmarish for them, and you felt like a complete bastard, really, and you just had to sort of tell yourself that that's what it's all about, that's what you have to do.
When other animals are going to their death, that they know that they have the same fate. So nobody's fooling anyone. These animals know the situation they're in. They may not know the specifics or the why, but they absolutely know that they are in an awful situation.
Even dairy farming, you're sort of part of the meat industry. You're sort of at the sharp end of the business. It was just a growing sense of unease and not wanting, although we were running a farm, not really wanting to sort of be part of the agricultural machine, sort of using animals.
Jay gave up farming beef and found permanent homes for his herd. He kept a few that he had a close bond with and has turned his 173 acres into natural hay meadows and has plans to diversify into horticulture.
We're going to plough one or two of the fields and start growing vegan organic market garden produce and supply some local shops and restaurants at the same time. It's exciting and terrifying because I've got no experience of growing market garden produce.
as the world population is growing and growing fast still, we are running out of land, literally, to be able to grow the animal feed to feed to all these billions of animals on this planet. The situation is getting desperate, and we're going into a massive issue with global food security. And consuming meat is a major part of that damage that's been done.
What's happened from the 50s, 60s and 70s and 80s as Britain got richer is people carried on eating meat, which was a feast day food, the Sunday joint, every day, multiple times a day. Some of the critics of this have argued this is a meat machine has been built up, wanting it ever cheaper. That has had a very big impact on the shape of British agriculture, that farming has been under pressure to produce meat and meat byproducts, and it's got cheaper, so the price signals have encouraged it. But now the evidence is that that's got to unravel. Animals are now our competitors. 30, 40, 50% in different countries, different parts of the world, of grain production is fed to animals. This is crazy. It'd be better for us to eat the grain that we grow directly and to put animals back into their ecological niche.
Western companies would like to replicate their model to the rest of the world. Certainly members of the farming sector would like everyone in China to start drinking milk, everyone in India to start eating as much chicken as they possibly can. And so we're trying to get them to move to our diet, saying it's going to be cheaper.
There's a complete chasm, a disconnect between what the evidence says we should be doing and what the policy signals are doing, and the economics, which is currently locked in. And that's bad news. Bad land use, bad news economically for the long term, terrible for climate change, and a disconnect with what culture ought to be.
Rising global temperatures, melting ice caps, greenhouse gases and loss of biodiversity are all topics that have hit the headlines in recent years.
You know that climate change is happening faster than even the most pessimistic of scientists warned us decades ago. It has become a runaway freight train, bringing with it an impending disaster for all living things. You are the last best hope of Earth. We ask you to protect it, or we and all living things we cherish are history.
In 2015, 194 nations signed up to the UN Climate Change Agreement in Paris. Its aim was to limit the increase in global temperatures by 2%. Modern agriculture was targeted as a major contributor.
I think the arrogance of humans to think they understand ecology is breathtaking, absolutely breathtaking. I think we are only just touching the hem of a science which is the equivalent of something almost godlike. It is extraordinarily complicated, and in its complication is essentially beautiful. We do know that nature seems to have a system of no waste, and we seem to be the only species that hasn't clocked that. The issue isn't climate change, it is the degree of climate change. What is actually happening is that we are greasing the wheels of the speed.
The Stockholm Resilience Centre, a world-leading scientific research facility for addressing complex challenges facing humanity, stated, "Agriculture is the single biggest threat to the global environment."
If one looks at the world as having a range of planetary boundaries, and if you look at, say, the work of the Stockholm Resilience Centre, where they identify 9 particular control systems that set boundaries within which there's a safe operating system for planet Earth, you will see that agriculture sits right there at the peak of its mountain. I mean, 43% of all of the impacts that are negative on Earth come from agriculture, and that comes from the inputs into the soil, both in terms of the chemicals for pesticides, in terms of, if you like, the nitrates for fertilization, right down to the equipment we use and the waste that we make and the packaging.
Scientists agree that agriculture is a heavy contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, particularly due to its methane emissions. But the farming lobby, including the National Farmers Union, has consistently argued against the inclusion of methane in any reductions targets.
The bit that's missing from the whole climate change debate, yes, I think renewable energy is really important, but we don't hear anything about food and farming. And when it's such a big contributor to climate change, it should be central. Livestock emissions equal about 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's the same as the whole of the transport sector put together. Climate change is going to get a lot worse because the animals produce emissions, their feed produces emissions, you're going to have large land use change, and you're going to have deforestation, so you're going to have more greenhouse gas emissions. We know the impacts are going to be horrible. We're seeing them now. We know we need to keep it at 1.5 degrees, so we need to have food and farming as central, not only to reducing emissions, but also to tackling climate change.
Environmentalists have campaigned for decades that large-scale intensive farming is disastrous for the planet. An argument has emerged that smaller, more sustainable mixed farms could be a solution to the problem.
Go on then. Oh, Dunstan, he looks at you with such beguiling eyes. He's quite timid. You wouldn't believe it looking at him, but he is.
Nicola and Sanjay run a non-slaughter herd of milking cows in England's smallest county, Rutland.
The reason we picked this place, one of the key reasons, was that it was organic land. We had to go for the best standards and the best welfare. What we wanted to show is a model, rather than this thing where you have to get more intensive and get bigger and bigger and bigger and become like these American mega dairies. We want to be able to demonstrate a model where we have villages of old, you know, where you know, people would look after cows, they'd milk cows by hand. Traditional farming, as it used to be, had so much to offer, and yes, it was back-breaking, it was hard work, but it was so much more satisfying than the lives that many young farmers are living today. And then when we spoke about, you know, the nature of the dairy industry and how it is possible to have milk where, you know, all the cows are kept and everybody's looked after, people said, well, you know, where can we get that milk?
Ahimsa have a herd of 32 cows, 11 of which are milked by hand once a day.
This is milk from last night, which was milked by hand last night, and it was cooled down, and now it's time to bottle so that we can take it to the market tomorrow morning. You know, it's funny, even since being here, we've had many farmers come and approach and say, we think what you're doing is really lovely. Will it really work? Well, we say, look, we're going for it, because we want to see a society where we can have cows which are looked after really nicely, cared for their whole life. We don't have to have this system of profits come first, then become principle. We want to be principle first, then profit afterwards.
The cooperative farms sell their milk to a growing community of supporters and at farmers' markets in London. The demand for their milk outstrips supply every week.
This is not a project about milk, and it's not about making profit from milk. Milk is part of it, it's an essential thing, but it's about working with cows and a non-slaughter, you know, policy. So we want to be slaughter-free, but we want to find a way to engage all of these animals.
You're going to be closer, my friend. I'll give you a brush. We enjoy a good massage, so do they.
Yeah.
They're sentient. They feel emotion. If you're stressed and angry, they sense that. If you start panicking, then they'll start panicking. When they work closely with humans, they become very, very pleasant.
Most of the animals on the farm stay in their family groups. Roles are found for all of the animals. Whilst the females provide milk, The males will till the land.
So this definitely requires a commitment to a certain lifestyle, and this kind of ties in naturally with the milking of the cows. You want cows to produce milk, and half the herd are going to be male. So what can they do? You want to give them some meaningful employment. That requires you then, they're ready to work. This is a farming system that's about appreciating, and it also means limiting, being satisfied with what nature gives, rather than trying to take more than nature naturally gives. Work with nature. I mean, with oxen, you can only go a certain distance a day. You work with that limit. You work the limits that nature gives you. Whereas in our society, we think by becoming more advanced technologically, we can somehow exploit nature. But actually, we're not finding any more happiness by that method. But we do see practically when people farm a little bit with this way, there's a certain satisfaction they get from it. Really, good job satisfaction. So again, it's about putting what is important. Is happiness important, or is the kind of idea of progress important? So this lifestyle makes you appreciate or experience a kind of more simpler type of lifestyle, and you get a happiness from it.
Human progress has led to the exploitation of some of our most precious natural resources. In some areas of the UK, scientists have estimated that there could be as little as 50 to 100 harvests left in the soil. The devastation to our soils has been brought about by extensive use of chemicals and fertilizers used to maximize crops.
Pesticides are massively used in the UK. Some are systemic, and that means they go into the body of the fruit. And some of them are sprayed on the outside, and so an element of washing or rubbing them off will take some of the pesticides off. However, it's not only the chemicals that are put onto the crops to help them grow, to get rid of the pests so that the farmer gets a good production rate at the end, but there are all the chemicals in the packaging. As a consumer, it's very difficult to know how much of a dose of pesticide you are being delivered in every mouthful you take.
Ted Green was conservation consultant to the Crown Estate at Windsor from 1998 to 2003. He's one of the country's leading experts on plant and tree health.
I'm 84. That means I was, up until my 20s or 30s, I was an organic child, because the pesticides and the real fertilizers, the organic, non-organic fertilizers that we use today, only came into the fashion or were being produced from the 50s. And now we've got, if you like, most things are smothered with pesticides, herbicides, and of course the man-made fertilizers. Now, by using man-made fertilizer, we actually lose the mycorrhizal fungi, and they're these microscopic threads which are picking up the minerals and nutrients for the plants. But if you ain't got them, then the plant can't pick them up. So most non-organic food does only have a minute amount of the suite of minerals and nutrients which you get from organic food. 80% of the soils of the world are degraded and disappearing, and we're doing nothing. And the erosion basically is caused by modern farming. The methods we use now, deep ploughing, great big ploughs.
At Knepp Castle in Sussex, 3,500 acres of arable land is being restored to natural grazing in an environmental experiment called rewilding. Over the past 10 years, the land at Knepp has been allowed to go fallow, or rest. Animals have been allowed to roam free, allowing a mosaic of habitats to re-establish themselves. the animals have needed little intervention.
This was originally a ploughed field, and in those days they would have ploughed right up to the tree. And now, here it is, it's gone to grass. You can see the animal poo over here. It's even got dung flies on it already. They're there breaking down that poo and putting it back into the soil. This is showing man how long it takes for soil to recover to get all the organisms in it. We're in a system now where human beings are eating lots and lots, or digesting, absorbing man-made chemicals. But that also applies to all the other organisms are subjected to it. Our beloved tree behind us is subjected to that. The soil, that is subjected to all these man-made chemicals. We've forgotten about nature.
So many of these pesticides and biocides and herbicides are estrogen and androgen disrupting chemicals.
We have in our bodies a chemical messenger system that controls our development, our metabolism, our reproduction, and that is our hormone system. Women tend to have a higher level of estrogen, men have a higher level of testosterone, and we all have a hormone called thyroid, which controls our neurological development as we are growing, but also controls our metabolism.
So much of the initial research on pesticides and biocides was, well, these are such minute amounts that they can't hurt anything. But what we've realized now is that even though these are in nanomolar concentration, they never leave the receptor, and so they build up over time.
They come into our bodies, and a hormone is like a lock and key mechanism. The hormone receptor is here, and there's a key, which is the hormone that comes in and it unlocks that receptor, and then you produce the action that you want. But there are some chemicals that can come in, and they are similarly shaped to the key, and they can switch on the receptor as well. Or they can in fact switch the receptor off. So this is where, when you've got, for example, a mother carrying a male fetus in utero, that male fetus's male programming window is between roughly week 8 and week 12. That is when you are making him a boy. If the mother is exposed to nasty chemicals that can turn off the masculine hormone, the androgen, the testosterone, then that baby boy can be born in a slightly feminized situation where he has undescended testicles, malformation of the penis, when he grows up a lower level of sperm count at 18, and this group of boys who have been exposed to nasty chemicals where they are slightly feminized then have a higher propensity to develop cancer of the testicle as well. The levels of these malformations is going up in boys in the UK, quite worryingly.
The depleted state of the majority of Britain's soils has been largely down to agricultural policies implemented by governments over a number of decades. DEFRA, the Department for Agriculture and Rural Affairs, has been advised closely by industry insiders, most notably from the National Farmers Union.
The NFU, from what I can see, do whatever the chemical industry tell them to do. There's an NFU advert arguing for the preservation of glyphosate, which I would swear was written by Monsanto. I mean, it's just got Monsanto written all over it, as far as I can see. It's almost the same kind of graphics as Monsanto. I mean, glyphosate was proclaimed to be completely safe until 5 or 10 years ago. It's now become apparent that it certainly isn't safe.
The whole story of glyphosate sounds like a good idea. Glyphosate is a herbicide, so it kills plants, and it was designed to kill actually all plants, including weeds.
You can spray wheat a couple of weeks before harvest with glyphosate, and it will effectively kill the plant. It'll dry it out. It means that you can harvest it. It'll also kill any weeds in the field.
The glyphosate is not washed off the soybeans. It's not washed off the corn. It's not washed off the wheat. And then we feed this to our farm animals, and we make it into products. We make it into our corn chips. We make it into our wheat thins. We make it into our crackers. We make it into our bread, thinking that it's going to cause no harm to us.
But it will be, the glyphosate will still be in the grain, and it'll be in the bread, and it'll be in everyone's urine who eats that bread. I mean, this is well established.
Glyphosate actually works on an enzyme system that only plants use to grow, and that humans don't have. It's called the shikimate pathway. Funny name. What they didn't realize, bacteria use the shikimate pathway to reproduce. So what we inadvertently did with glyphosate is we killed off our bacteria flora in our microbiome that actually is most of us.
The evidence of the health impacts of consuming glyphosate in terms of endocrine disruption and so on are just starting to appear, really, and most of the diseases that it could be associated with are very long-term degenerative diseases that you wouldn't see in, wouldn't be apparent in a population immediately. It's just a moronic outrage, I mean, the benefits are minuscule and the risks are very substantial, it should be banned.
Ultimately, that pesticide, if it goes into the crop, well then you or I eat it. If it goes onto the soil or blows away on the wind, it will eventually land somewhere. It ends up in the soil, it then rains, the rain then runs into the rivers, and the rivers get contaminated, and the surrounding wildlife can get contaminated as well. And that is how a lot of the marine environment gets very nastily contaminated too, is the runoff from our agricultural processes on land.
You have problems with fertilisers going into waterways, causing eutrophication, it kills fish, it clogs up rivers. If you look at most of the rivers in the United Kingdom, they're green. And that's the fertilisers going into the river, which means sort of lots and lots of plants start growing, it starts suffocating the fish in the river, so it's not very clean. That goes out to the sea and you have these oceanic dead zones.
We, in the UK, we have a resident population of orcas, killer whales. They are the most magnificent creatures, and you see them gently arcing through the water. But very, very sadly, they haven't reproduced for 25 years. There's been autopsies on those that have been found dead and toxicological analysis. And we now know that is because of the levels of harmful chemicals in mostly the females. The orcas are so highly contaminated with these chemicals that they are no longer capable of reproducing. And these are some of our most charismatic megafauna that we have in UK waters. And it's a tragedy.
Our president, Dwight Eisenhower, when he finished his presidency in 1960, his final address was to beware the military-industrial complex. And I think if we were to say something now, we really have to beware the pharmaceutical, political, chemical, and agricultural complex. This is huge business on a massive scale, and our politicians are paid to look the other way.
Environmental groups like the Soils Association, the World Wildlife Fund and Friends of the Earth in the UK have been campaigning for decades about the harmful effects that modern farming methods are having on animals, the land and the environment. In January 2018, the UK government announced a 25-year plan for the environment at an event in Westminster hosted by the Sustainable Soils Alliance.
I remember travelling in the southwest of England and seeing swollen rivers that were the colour of soil, and that's because they were full of soil, and it was being transported very quickly into the ocean. And of course the way in which we farm was facilitating this. And I remember seeing plough lines coming down the side of hills, down towards watercourses, very efficiently removing soil from the land and into the sea. Of course, bringing with it a range of environmental problems, not only the loss of soil from farmland, but also pollution of watercourses and also the marine environment.
The 25-year environmental plan sets out government action to help the natural world regain and retain good health. Cleaner air and water, minimising waste and pollutants, using natural resources more responsibly, protection of natural habitats, and increasing biosecurity. It's a plan intended to outlive the life of any government or parliament.
Often I find, as I go around, a tension between environmental NGOs on the one side and farmers on the other. And if we talk about the environment, farmers will say you don't care about food production. And if I talk about food production, NGOs say, oh well, what are you going to do to our environment? And I think we need to try to dismantle that antagonism, because I think it's a false antagonism. And what I'm seeking to achieve is maybe a fusion of some of the traditional approaches to farm husbandry and soil husbandry, the type of thing that my great-grandfather might have done, with some of the best science and technology available to us today.
The 25-year plan for the environment is a promising step forward, but it fails to address the fundamental issues over the impacts of food and farming to the environment and animal welfare. A recent Lancet commissioned report states, food systems have the potential to nurture human health and support environmental sustainability. However, they are currently threatening both. Providing a growing global population with healthy diets from sustainable food systems is an immediate challenge. Tim Lang was one of the consultants in the report.
The analysis from science is now saying produce less meat. Eat less meat for public health reasons. We're over-consuming meat and dairy products in the rich world. But grow less, because that would be better use of land. So a new argument is now emerging, which the politicians aren't engaging with at all.
Ultimately, there's also going to be a need for governments to act, because the scale of consumer change that's required in quite often an uneducated consumer market is just not going to occur without government intervention. I mean, the UN estimates are we need to cut consumption in developed economies by about 1/3 per person. That's just not going to come, I think, through the sort of work that we do. That's going to require the government to legislate in some way, shape or form.
I think the government's got a role to do here. It's already nanny-stating us. So if it's already nanny-stating us and it's making us sick and it's destroying the natural environment and it's causing animal welfare implications, maybe the government should just go, okay, we're going to keep being involved, but we're going to do it for good outcomes. So we take away VAT on fruit and vegetables across the board. We make sure that public sector procurement promotes British produce and promotes healthy eating. it makes the Eat Well guidelines sustainable dietary guidelines. We make sure that trade deals are about healthy food, not chlorine-washed chicken, as an American.
I mean, we're looking at global, in the year 2050 being 9.5, 10 billion people. Well, the current food system isn't going to be able to sustain that, so we have to think of different ways. And one of the ways is going more plant-based, eating much more plants, reducing meat intake.
Ultimately, we need to change the infrastructure. We need to change our belief system and raise awareness, and we need to make plant foods much more accessible. And part of that means not subsidizing cheap meat, because one of the reasons people eat so much meat is because it's so cheap. It's unnaturally cheap.
Probably the most fundamental start point would be rather than encourage plant proteins, actually just set a level playing field. So if you think beef farming and most forms of animal protein farming is a heavily subsidised industry here in the UK. In the US it's subsidised even more heavily. So first of all, it's subsidised. Secondly, it produces very significant externalities. So CO2 emissions, damage to the environment that's not costed into the product, water damage, etc. If those externalities were taxed appropriately, that would level up the playing field.
I would like to see the UK commit to a 50% reduction in livestock by 2030. And if you think about in the life cycle of animals, nearly all the livestock living at the moment will be dead by then. It's a transition period, but we need to have less livestock numbers. We need to transition away from industrial systems, and I would argue move to more natural systems where animals are more in their natural environment. Chickens are amazing animals. They're omnivorous. They will eat anything. You have a chicken, a free-range chicken, it digs up grubs, it'll eat the slugs, it'll eat the snails, and you rear chickens like that. Pigs, again, pigs eat anything. They're dustbins. So pigs in the right numbers are really good at getting rid of food waste. We can start feeding food waste to pigs, not feeding soy and maize to pigs. So we can have a future with animals, but it just means far less numbers going forward.
The UK food system, you've got to remember, is connected with the rest of the world, but particularly with the European Union. We've been in the EU for the best part of half a century, and a third of our food comes from within the European Union. So there's a hidden labour force, a hidden farming, a hidden impact there. For me, one of the critical test beds is horticulture. We actually heavily import our horticultural produce. 90%, 88% to be accurate, of our fruit is imported. 45% of our vegetables are imported. On health grounds, we should be doubling those. In other words, we've got a big problem.
Transitioning to a sustainable food system is not only essential for animals and the environment, it's also essential for the growing population. But achieving this seismic shift is going to need the cooperation of government, business, consumers and farmers, all working together.
The truth is, if we want to successfully get the world of agriculture in balance with the planetary boundaries, we will need to see a massive reduction in the eating of meat, at the same time as making sure that the farmers who previously grew meat, who grew cattle, sheep, whatever, get hugely recompensed for growing fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer animals to a better and better quality of life. Most farmers I know are actually up for that conversation. They really are. What we need, though, is to market the perspective that we may need to pay 10 times more for our meat, to have 10 times less meat.
We have all the solutions to fixing the food system now. We don't need to worry about anything else. If we're growing enough food for 14 billion people, why are we wasting 30% of the food and feeding the vast majority of our cereal crops to livestock? So we need to do tweaks to the current system. We need to make sure farmers are supported. Farmers should not be the ones who suffer because they're not the ones who caused this food system. It's been caused by many other reasons, and whether that's businesses, governments, large-scale agricultural companies, it's not the farmers who do it. So I'd like to see greater diversity of crops. I think one of the fundamental things we can do is, as people, is eat a greater variety of food, which will encourage farmers to grow a greater variety of food.
I get it, I see what the problem is, so what's the solution? One of the things we're coming up with is the mushroom growing. It's a sustainable source, and it's also a solution for people who want to transition out of animal agriculture and still farm. You can farm mushrooms because you can do it indoors, you can do it in any country, any climate, and the volumes you can produce and what we can do with mushrooms is amazing.
We've been led to believe for decades by food producers and their marketing teams that animal meat is the best source of protein for our bodies. But recent research conducted by Exeter University into a fungus-based food called mycoprotein has revealed some astonishing new data which could change the way we think about protein and where we source it.
The research we're doing here at Exeter relates to asking some important questions about where the protein in our diet should come from. Animal proteins have been used in nutritional research quite extensively because they have what we think of as a very good amino acid profile. It's typically been thought that a lot of plant-based proteins don't have such an optimal amino acid profile, to such an extent that we wanted to investigate this and provide evidence either for or against. Okay, so this will just feel a little bit cold. So this is
the University of Exeter are undergoing a live experiment. They're running 2 parallel studies using athletes to see how their bodies metabolize different sources of protein.
Well done.
One study group is given a strict controlled diet containing meat and dairy. The other is given a strict vegan diet containing plants and mycoprotein.
The question that arises now with increasing awareness and desire to support issues surrounding sustainable food production, environmental concerns and ethical concerns is why we don't have that equivalent data concerning non-animal derived protein sources. This is the gap in the knowledge that we're aiming to fill. Previous research conducted on mycoprotein has shown beneficial effects on some markers of metabolic health. So for instance, when people have incorporated mycoprotein as part of their daily diet, they've shown reductions in circulating cholesterol.
Mycoprotein was discovered in the late 60s in a collaboration between film distributor J. Arthur Rank and the bakers Hovis McDougall. The joint venture was in response to the government's concerns over feeding the population after the Second World War.
Mycoprotein is based on a tiny member of the fungi family that grows quite naturally. So the way that we grow it is probably similar to the way that we make beer. So it's in the age-old process of fermentation. And then the real magic is freezing. I think it was the Japanese monks who used to take tofu and freeze it. And that would then, if you've ever frozen tofu, you have to do it very carefully, but it does transform the texture into something that's sort of quite fibrous and almost meat-like, I think. And it's that simple process of freezing that transforms the texture.
A process similar to raising dough in bread making results in enough mycoprotein to produce over 5 million meals of corn.
You really are harnessing the power of nature. In fact, actually, if you go right back to start, you could see just little sort of dots in your hand. That's got the capability of producing 40,000 tonnes of mycoprotein. And so from that, you get a sense of just, how efficient it is. And of course, the benefit of that is how environmentally benign it is compared to other forms of protein production.
Speaking specifically about mycoprotein, we have encouraging data to suggest that it may well be a viable protein source that you could replace large amounts of animal protein in your diet.
Really important because it removes, when we publish this, a consumer uncertainty that exists around, well, surely I've got to eat animal protein because that's the best quality protein that there is. So we're out to kind of explode that myth and say, no, it doesn't have to be that way.
In January 2019, the Canadian government revised its dietary guidelines for the first time in 12 years. Health Canada officials did not meet with any lobby groups. The Health Minister, Jeanette Pettipas-Taylor, said, "This shift toward plant-based foods comes despite intense lobbying from the meat and dairy industries." The shift in trend to more sustainable diets can't be the responsibilities of governments alone. If we are to meet climate change targets, improve animal welfare, and eat diets that improve our health, then it is us who need to make that change happen.
I think that is a $6 million question of how do you change that when someone goes into a store and buys McNuggets or something. What is the answer? Well, I think the answer is that people should stop eating them. However, how do you get to that point? Well, I think you have to first educate people about who these animals are. That there's someone on your plate when you go to a restaurant and order meat. And some people are going to understand that and take that to heart and say, you know, I can't eat a baby cow anymore, I can't eat a chick anymore. Other people are not going to be reachable in that way.
People are also, I think, creatures of habit and tend to do what is easy and what is convenient and what is in front of them. And that's why I think it's incredibly important for plant-based foods to become much more accessible in the marketplace. There are businesses now starting to invest in plant-based agriculture, both on the production side and on the retail side. And I think that's going to make this lifestyle much easier, and I think that's going to help catapult it.
All the nutrients that we require as a human being we get from a plant diet. Therefore, it is imperative, and it's our moral imperative for the future of our kids, for the future of our grandkids, that we change to a vegan diet and that we do it quickly.
I believe the people control, so it's up to us. You can find any reason at all not to be plant-based or not to eat this way. And it's mostly based on habit, culture, like your generation, how you were raised, but that doesn't make it right.
In 2017, World Football's governing body FIFA voted Forest Green Rovers the greenest football club in the world. Its stadium in Gloucestershire is run with 100% renewable energy. It hosts an organic pitch, rainwater collection to irrigate the pitch, and is the world's first vegan football club.
And I'd say we had some kickback from some fans. You know, they were a bit angry, some of them felt they were being dictated to and stuff like that, and we explained why we were doing it and that we were going to go on this journey, and that actually we thought they could keep an open mind, come to a football game and try something different, something they don't normally eat, because a football game is only once a fortnight for a couple of hours on average. I remember people saying at the time, look, you'll kill the club if you do this, nobody will come here, nobody will eat here, and that kind of stuff. And you know, food sales have quadrupled in that period, so that turned out to be wrong. Even the most ardent of meat eaters tell me that, you know, they love the food. Some people come here just for the food. Our message has gone around the world. Since May last year, we've reached 1.5 billion people around the world. We were invited to the United Nations for COP23 in November to go and talk about the role of sport in helping fight climate change. And you know, we took our message to some of the top sporting organisations and clubs of the world. So it's way beyond Britain, way beyond my wildest dreams, and I have a sense that we're really just getting started.
At Washington Academy in Leicestershire, headmaster Jason O'Rourke puts food education at the heart of his primary school's philosophy.
Wow. Did you not make this?
Yeah.
They carry the gold standard for food catering from the Soil Association.
We've got children not having a connection now with farms, with where their vegetables and their fruit comes from. They're not having that hands-on experience of it. And they are seeing that food is just coming pre-packaged from supermarkets, from shops, and not knowing the sourcing of it. And part of the curriculum that we've developed is looking at where their food comes from.
Today they are holding Grandparents' Gardening Day, a day where different generations can come together to share their love of food.
As part of the curriculum that we've developed, we have lessons where children are using their senses to explore food.
Cinnamon. I think it is cinnamon.
Children are naturally curious. They want to know where things are coming from. So with our gardening that we have, the children are picking the seeds that they want to grow. They're nurturing those seeds, they're doing the weeding, they're watering them, then they are harvesting them, and they want to know what those foods taste like. We have a very big area for growing for our school kitchen as well. We created a children's kitchen, all at their level. We created a herb wheel that supplies our children's kitchen and our commercial kitchen as well. And I think that's then, with the teacher's skills at developing the learning through that medium, through that catalyst of food, we have a very powerful combination of children learning, and they don't really know that they're learning, which is, you know, for any educationalist, is the golden bullet.
Britain is an urbanised country. Don't have any fantasies about gardening feeding us. It's marvellous, it's great, I love it, and we should do more of it, but it's not feeding us. It's about land use and food supply chains. So we proposed the notion of one nation food to try and say to the politicians, look, wherever you're coming from, you've got to think about feeding the whole nation, and you're not. And it's a highly divided nation. It isn't, we said one nation food, because actually it's not one nation. It's divided. The rich are run away with power and influence, and the poor have been crushed, and their incomes are down and have been static if they're lucky to have incomes, and so they eat badly, and so they're dying early. And diet is one of the main drivers. So we asserted this notion of one nation food to actually say, we think this is unacceptable and a better vision for food is possible. And that's what we meant by one nation food. Everyone, whoever they are, black, white, male, female, young, old, rich, poor, we've got to feed them all well, and we're not.
We've come a long way since the food rations of the Second World War. Food has become plentiful and more than any of us need or could possibly eat. And that has created problems for our health, the animals and the environment. But now the evidence is overwhelmingly clear, and our complacency cannot continue. We need to take an active role as citizens and ask our governments to stop subsidising meat and dairy products and unsustainable methods of agriculture. We need to end industrial factory farming of animals and insist on tighter animal welfare control and regular monitoring to avoid abuses. Future trade deals should be limited to those countries that adopt the same or better animal welfare standards than our own. Harmful chemicals should be banned. Organic produce needs to become a necessity rather than a luxury, and farmers need to be encouraged to do more. Our supermarkets need to produce clearer, simpler labelling so we can see at a glance where our food has come from. And we need to make a fundamental shift in our own attitude to food. We need to take responsibility for the food that we eat and the impacts that those choices have on the animals, ourselves, and the planet.